The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, the past, the present, and the future are all in your hands. Give us the grace and the strength to believe that and with all our hearts. And lead us to the bright future that you have in store for your church and your world. In Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. This is the second installment of a three-part series that I'm calling Changing Seasons, Bright Future. We started last week by reviewing some of the numbers that we have about how churches are doing in modern society. We've looked at the decline of how important religion is in people's lives when surveyed. We've looked at the decline in attendance in the Episcopal Church. We took a moment to be sullen and blue about that. And then we turned our hearts just a little bit to say, but wait a second. Wait a second. People in this new, more secular world need faith, hope, love, forgiveness, perhaps more than ever. People in this largely secular world are out there looking for transcendence and transformation. And transcendence and transformation and forgiveness, hope, faith, love, grace, peace, all of those things are what the church has to offer in abundant supply. Our only challenge is figuring out how to offer our treasure in an unfamiliar environment. And we, the universal church, have done that before. I think that if we take time to reflect now and to envision a bright future for the church's greatest days may still be ahead. And I look at that with so much hopefulness. The new transaction between the church and its people is not avoidance of hell or aiming for heaven. The new transaction is about transcendence and transformation. How is it that the church changes my life for the better? That was where we were last week. We talked about some regional differences that we're seeing in the northeastern United States, on the west coast of the United States, seeing in Europe as well. And we speculated as to whether that wave would sort of wash over the south as well. My hypothesis is that it will. And even if it doesn't, nothing wrong with being prepared for the future anyway. And we, at this really strong time in the life of Church of the Holy Communion, have an opportunity to prepare ourselves for that future. Just as an aside, in case any further support and evidence were needed for this case that I've been making, I was listening to NPR yesterday afternoon, and the segment on the media interviewed a New York Times reporter who had covered the Supreme Court for, say, 25 years or so, and was now writing opinion pieces for the Times. I missed her name. I sort of swerved the car over to write down notes so I wouldn't forget what she was saying. Because she said this: religion is America's last taboo. Religion is America's last taboo. And the interviewer asked what she meant by that. And she said, religion is the only subject that you can't talk with people about at a social function. And I wanted to say, come to the South. That is not taboo here at all. But it was a wonderful example just in yesterday's radio broadcast of the regional differences that we're seeing in the United States. Someone who writes for the New York Times sees religion as a taboo conversation, whereas here in the South it's not. So I just continue to hold up that the situation around us is changing. And it's to our advantage to understand that and to plan for it and to be strategic about it. And if we are, I think that our future will be very, very bright. That was our forum last week. This week we're going to talk about two important subjects: power and money. It's not a church service if you're not talking about power and money, but here we are. My contention is this: younger generations have a different relationship with power and money than older generations do. Younger generations have a different relationship with power and money than older generations do. And the church needs to understand both. You can be honest. How many people in this room played Tetris? Excellent, excellent. Could I ask you to put your hands up higher, please? Who in this room played Tetris? And then could I ask you, please, to keep your hand up if you have played this game? Did you notice a shift in who had their hand up? I'm actually only, you can put your hands down, I'm only holding my hand up as an example. I have not, in fact, played this second game. But I want to use this as an example. The church leaders of today grew up either playing or watching their children play Tetris. And credit where credit is due, I'm following very closely here the work of Henry Timms and Jeremy Hyman's, and the citation is on the back page of your note sheet. They had a similar article published in the Harvard Business Review on this subject. So I'm following very closely their literature here. Church leaders of today grew up playing or watching their children play Tetris. Tetris as a game is orderly and predictable. For those of you who may not have experienced this, little blocks come down from the top of the screen, and you maneuver the blocks around so that they create patterns here in the bottom, and when you get a certain pattern, those blocks disappear. But if you don't get that pattern, the blocks just start to climb, and you lose when it reaches the top of the screen. It's a very simple first-generation computer game. The most popular computer game of the 20th century. The blocks come down, you maneuver them around, and the goal is to keep your tower from collapsing under its own weight. Everyone plays by the same rules. All of the new information is introduced from the top down, and you make no choices about what your role is in the game. Minecraft, which I'm stepping out on the edge of my knowledge here, most popular electronic game of the 21st century. In Minecraft, your goal is to create a whole new world. And that world is created by conversations among the people who are playing. The rules are determined by the players of the game. The goal is determined by the players of the game. Nothing comes down from on high. Information is coming from every angle and every person, and networks are being made. And what Timms and Hyman's suggest is this is representative of the cultural shift in understandings of power. People in my generation and above, well, sort of half a generation ahead of me and above, are trained to follow rules, accept hierarchical structures, and play the role that's assigned to them. People below me are not. It's a whole new way of conceiving of the world. Timms and Hyman's refer to this as old power and new power. Old power is hierarchical, top down. Old power is orderly because it is based on established, clearly defined, understandable rules. New power has very little in common with that. New power is what they call crowdsourced. Everyone providing their opinion, their insight, bringing what they have, finding knowledge together. New power questions the legitimacy of hierarchies and the legitimacy of arbitrary rules. In new power, people expect to have a role in determining what their role is going to be. In a new power situation, people expect to have a role in determining what their role is going to be. I want to offer offer you a brief aside from my seminary days. I was taking a class, I think it was an upper level sequence in Revelation, if I'm not mistaken, which is a challenging text to say the least. And we went to the first day of class, and the professor gave us our syllabus, which said this is what you're expected to do, and these are what the assessments are going to be, and all that. And so I went back to my room and took out my calendar and wrote down the things that needed to be done and the schedule on which they needed to be done. And a classmate came to me and said, I think I'm going to drop this class. And I said, well, why? Why would you drop the class? And she said, I just don't like the way the assessments are structured. It never occurred to me that I should have an opinion on how the assessments were structured. That's not my role. That's the professor's role. But for this other person, she saw herself having a role in evaluating how she was going to be evaluated. Old power, new power. Top down, accepting of hierarchy, accepting of structure, questioning hierarchy, questioning structure. It's just different. It's just different. When we look at the Episcopal Church, and I love the Episcopal Church. I'm a company man. I was here when I started, I'll be here when I finish. I love the Episcopal Church, old power institution. It is a clearly old power institution. At the denominational level, policy is made by a body that we call the General Convention. I've described the General Convention in this room. I've been to, I think, 6 or 7 of them. The General Convention of the Episcopal Church is twice as large as the United States Congress and 2 years older. It has met in unbroken succession since 1785 for the purpose of establishing canons that read like laws, which tell the church how to operate. That's what it does. And those rules are published in a book where you cite them by title, by canon, by section, and paragraph to give guidance for how it is that we at Church of the Holy Communion are going to do the work of God. Old power. At the congregational level, the rector appoints the staff, defines the liturgy, and serves to interpret the scripture. When you step into this room next door, the one under that big point on the street, when you step into that room, you are expecting that the clergy are going to do specific things. And you're expecting that you're not. It's not going to happen that one of you is going to be asked to preach the sermon in an hour's time. It's not going to happen that one of you is going to be asked to celebrate the Eucharist. Why is that? Because the system has said that is the role of the clergy. And specifically, that's the role of the rector who appoints assistant clergy. Those of you who served on vestry will know that when it comes to defining liturgy, how we do the service, that's not a vestry decision. That's a clergy decision. Old power. Where did that authority come from? We say that it came as a gift from Almighty God himself, coming down through the bishop, who operates as an outside authority, who defines who it is in this congregational system, who is going to make certain decisions. Old power. Some of you will know, I've said only half jokingly, the word rector, it's a strange word. You kind of think about what its etymology is. It derives from the Latin word rex, which means king. Absolutely true. Not to be left out, let's draw the vestry into this. The vestry is a closed body. You have to be elected onto it. Of clearly defined and qualified people. You have to meet certain qualifications, even to stand for election. They operate under something called parliamentary procedure, which evokes 800 years of British governance. And all of the financial and physical and temporal decisions around here get made by that body. We don't come to the congregation and say, what do you think? Should we spend this money on youth, or should we spend this money on children? Should we repair the roof, or should we do the air conditioning? We don't do that. That's the vestry's responsibility. I happen to think that's wise, but it's old power. It's the structure and the hierarchy and the defining of who is going to make what decision. Old power. Now, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, shall we? Let's not burn down the house in some grand revolution over these questions of power. I think that some structure is really important. You can sort of see that in the general conversation about religion. When religion becomes too individual, when it loses any sense of accountability or structure, not only to other people, but to the heritage that brought it along, that faith can start to look unrecognizable. Me and my Jesus are going to figure this out. Well, yes, we do have a personal engagement with Jesus. Yes, we do have personal access to the Scripture, but we also have each other and church history and tradition as a back check against our interpretation to say, wow, what I'm thinking is not in standard with some structure that's there. I think that's a good thing. I think that's important to the preservation of our faith. It's not my faith and your faith, it's our faith. The faith once given to the apostles, as the Scripture says. Balance is going to be key. What I suggest to you is that my beloved Episcopal Church needs to start experimenting with some new power, or it, like Tetris, is going to collapse under its own weight. We need to start doing that. We need to not go all new power all the time, but we need to start thinking about what would it be for a project to start within our congregation, not supervised by the rector or by the vestry. What would it be for some initiative to come up from the grassroots and just happen? What would it be for a group of people not to be called a committee and elect a chair and have minutes, but to just meet and talk and pray and think? The article that's cited on the back page of your handout, the authors actually look at Nadia Bolz-Weber's Church of Saints and Sinners as an example of new power. And the example that they share from that congregation is when a newcomer walks in the door, the greeters team will say, would you like to read the Scripture today? Would you like to serve the chalice? Because the holy things aren't just reserved for the holy people who have been here already. The holy things belong to all of us. I heard a little chuckle from Ben Adams' section of the congregation over there, perhaps imagining what I would say if I walked into a church and said, do you want to read the lesson? No, I don't. Thank you very much. I would like to hide behind that big pillar for just a little while and figure out what's going on here. That too is balance. That too is balance. Jane Shaw, who used to be the dean of Grace Cathedral San Francisco and is now, I think, a professor at Oxford in the United Kingdom, wrote an article that I absolutely should have put on the back of the sheet, and I'll put it on next week's for your reference. But she wrote an article in the Church Times, which you can find online, where the Church of England is about to invest in a whole bunch of church plants and house churches and little cell groups, and this is their strategy for the future. And she argues that it needs to be both that and investing in the large churches that are growing, because some people do want to hide behind that pillar for a little while. Some people do want to step into the community and have a chance to figure it out before they're asked to step up front. And that's true too. It's both and, not either or. Credit where credit is due. Presiding Bishop Michael Curry is doing an awfully good job of calling us to this greater understanding of power. His tagline is, "We are the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement." Maybe you've heard that in some church literature. I linked to his website on that subject on the back of the handout sheet. The Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement. Movements are shaggy things. Movements are conglomerations of people that move around like those flocks of birds that just kind of go in and out, and you wonder how they're not bumping into one another. That's a movement. I think for me, he's swung a little too far over, but I commend him for drawing our attention there, because we need to be thinking about those things. The General Convention in 2012, I believe, passed a resolution, which you can find. It has a special code number and many sections and subsections, establishing what they call mission enterprise zones. Mission enterprise zones in which the canons can be relaxed and grants can be given to churches and priests and other communities of faith that want to experiment with new ways of being the church. And that's a good idea too. But we need to do more. And we in the churches that are doing fine, where the traditional model of being church is still doing fine, we need to be playing with this too, rather than waiting for crisis to come upon us. Before I shift into talking about money, I'd like to pause, and Emily's got the microphone so that we can all hear each other. The masks make it difficult. I'd like to, what are your reactions to this? What are some systems of old power that you see around us, either in the Episcopal Church or Church of the Holy Communion, that we might want to think about whether they need to stay with us? And what are some ways that we might experiment with new power? Just thoughts. I'm not going to hold you to anything, but just your reaction to this for us. Just wait for the microphone, Lisa, please.
I have a question more than a thought. And I'm involved in this, I used to be very involved in this large volunteer organization in Memphis. And when you were talking about old power, new power, and the new members versus what the members just assumed we were going to do 20 years ago, and I was actively involved, is very, very different. And the new members are questioning certain things, and why do we have to pay dues to volunteer, and stuff like that. And so, as I'm thinking about the church and old power and new power, I don't like change very much. And so I would think, how do you stop the whole structure from crumbling once you start to get rid of the structure of the old power? You know, it's interesting dynamic that as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, this is happening in the volunteer organizations, it's happening in the churches, it's happening, and I do think it's this younger generation that's really making a lot of, you know, I'm not an old timer, but I'm in the middle of the group of generation, and I'm just like, what?
Yes, exactly. Lisa, what you're sharing there is absolutely on point. This is not just people's understanding of how to be church is changing. This is people's understanding of how to encounter the world is changing. And if those people who have a different understanding of how to encounter the world than those of us who came before them, if the church can't anticipate that, the church will not be able to speak to them. That's what I'm getting at. It's exactly correct. And there's a wonderful old joke, how many Episcopalians does it take to change out a light bulb? And it has any number of answers. My personal favorite is, how many Episcopalians does it take to change out a light bulb? Change! Or perhaps 3, 1 to actually do the job, and 2 to discuss how much better the old light bulb was. You know, that sort of thing. But that's where we are, and the question that you raise is such a good one. How do we keep the structure there such that the institution can carry forward while we tinker around with these different models and different expressions? And I don't have a great answer for you. As I look at the church, and we're going to talk about the institution in just a moment, I think that the institution, for me, needs to continue. We need to have that accountability. We need to have that check place. We need to have a place where we draw together people who wouldn't draw together as a house church or as a small collective. There has to be room for more than that. And that's going to require the institution to some level. But what is the level, I think, is the question. How can we start experimenting, or maybe even setting some boundaries? Okay, we're going to let this happen. And it's going to happen the way it happens, and things are going to move around, and we're going to see how it works. An example, when I came to Holy Communion 8 years ago, there was a group that had been meeting here for a very long time. and they were having trouble finding officers for the group. And so I was meeting with the head of the group, and she said, well, I mean, I've been the president forever and ever and ever, and then, you know, so-and-so's been the secretary, and she keeps the minutes, but we're trying to fit, and then the treasurer, and, gosh, we have to find somebody to be the treasurer. And I said, well, what if you don't? What do you mean? I said, well, the money, you don't have to have an independent checkbook for this organization within the church. We can hold that in the church's operating account and write whatever checks you need to have written. Oh, and maybe you don't need to have minutes. Oh, it's just a different way of thinking. And it gave them a lot more room. Now, the vestry has a legal obligation to the Tennessee Nonprofit Corporations Act, so we do need to have a secretary, and we do need to have minutes and such. But it used to be that the women of the church, the Brotherhood of St. Andrew, the Sunday school guilds, and the altar guild would have meetings and elected officers and published minutes. And I'm just not sure that's necessary anymore. And that's just one sort of place where I've already seen us moving in that direction. But your question is a good one, and I don't know how far to go without, I think we have to work to figure out how far. Maya, I saw your hand up.
For those that are concerned with too much change and the crumbling, I would argue also that there is a hunger and desire from younger generations for some sort of organizational,
Could you speak up just a
for
little
some organizational stability. Because we've gone our gamut of different types of churches and kind of seen what they are, and kind of what drew us to an Episcopal church was some sort of history. Because when things are great, they're great. But when challenges arise, if you don't have a history, a tradition, an organizational structure, a body of elders to help through those, then change can cause a lot of unhappiness and a lot of struggle. And so I'd argue that there are a lot of people kind of existing in the New Power thoughts who still want some kind of structure. And so I don't think questions of old power or towards old power have to be a threat so much as a reconsideration, maybe, of some things, but not all things.
Maya, that is such a helpful point, and thank you for that. That we don't want to paint all people with one brush. And I also think that we're in this dynamic place of figuring out what the new norms are going to be. And so often, when you're in that place of change, pendulums swing, right? And they swing out a little bit too far, and then we come on back in. And when it comes to a truly sort of new power, crowdsourced model, when something ceases to work, it ceases to exist. It just goes away. The faith can't go away. The church can't go away. It loses all of its point and power when that happens. So how do we do that? And I do think that there are a lot of folks that we would put into the New Power camp who find it wearying that we have to figure out everything for ourselves. And that there's something nice about stepping into a structure that says, I don't have to work that hard right now. I can step into, one of my professors used to refer to liturgy as a rolling river that we step into and step out of, but the current keeps going, and we know that the current keeps going. You see another hand? Daniel.
C.S. Lewis said, I can take any kind of liturgy if it can just stay put. He said, Jesus said, feed my sheep, not teach my old dogs new tricks.
But yet. Well, Emily's walking over. Maya, when you were speaking, I couldn't help but think that, for those of you who don't know Maya well, she's a scientist by training, and that living organisms are changing and dynamic. And when they stop changing and stop being dynamic, they die. And that attraction to, it's a complicated world, let me keep one thing the same. Let me keep my church exactly the same, because everything else in the world is changing, is not a strategy for this organism to thrive in the future. Mike?
Sandy, I do not disagree with your thesis. And yes, our Episcopal Church does have a very ecclesiastical structure. And I think as the church as a whole, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But when I look at Holy Communion, the things that bubble up here from the people who volunteer, who involved deeply in so many different organizations locally, I think we have so many elements that you're talking about already existing here. While it may be more structural in other churches about what the group should focus on, I think here you're probably challenged on a number of cases of people coming to you saying, let's do this, let's do that. So I don't know that we're really in a stratified situation right now as much as a lot of other organizations are.
Yeah, I think I would say we're in a better spot than most, but still have room to grow and improve. A mentor of mine used to say that the rector's job is to say yes as much as possible, because if someone has taken the time and the thought to say, I think my faith community should do this, who am I to say, no, we're not going to do that? Thank you very much, but no. Ben and Charlton.
I think it is important to talk about this in the context of other areas, because in the business world, we've been talking about this for a long time, the whole attitude of the young workers, the fact that they don't sense any loyalty toward where they're working, so they quickly move around. They're looking for a different type of career. And there's some fairness because there's not as much loyalty from the employer to the employee as there used to be either. And reflecting what Lisa said about the nonprofits, and their whole mentality is a totally different mentality than what I grew up with. But our problem is, look at this room. We don't have any of them in here. And so we got to figure out a way to better understand, better dialogue, and meet them halfway.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ben. And I will note that, and Charlton's next, I will note that Timms and Hyman, the article that I used for today, because it was closer to on point, was an Associated Press article, which is linked on the back of your paper. But if you search their names in Harvard Business Review, you'll find what they wrote in the HBR, which also gets to these ideas for in a very astute business publication. Charlton.
Well, I was thinking, you talked earlier about the old power and new power. And in my experience of Holy Communion is there has been a surprising level of new power bubbling up from the congregation. And I am thinking specifically of outreach programs. And I qualify what I'm saying that I may be uninformed on some areas. But I think of all the food that we gave to Constance Abbey, the food that was given to Emmanuel Center, the food bank. Now, Hester may have made some phone calls to get somebody plugged into those shots, those slots. But by and large, it was the volunteers that took over the show. And I'm leaving out Team Reed. Team Reed was a very good example of Emily Woodside started that, in my opinion. And it just bubbled to the top under its own energy.
The Book of 5K that we had the other day has a lot of staff support to it, but was a couple of parishioners saying, we've got to do something, and forwarding the money to say, well, we'll put the starting money down so that we can do this wonderful thing. I agree with you completely.
But I think that's a wonderful characteristic that we have. And we're in what I see is this transition of, it's not the rector saying we need to feed Constance Abbey. It's parishioners saying, here's a need and we can do this.
I agree with you completely. And we also, and I'm going to exercise some old power in just a moment and say we're moving on. But I'll just note, since Charlton raised outreach, that a couple of years ago, Sherry Murphy came on with Hester to reorganize the outreach committee so that it wasn't turned it from a sort of grant-giving organization, well, we're going to seek organizations to which we can write a check, but turning it into how can we invest financial resources and volunteer resources and heart and soul resources. And the outreach committee turned into the people who were the captains of all the various ministries. So that it was a table that was coming together of the people who were doing the work and saying, this is where we need to go. And I think that was a really great example of experimenting with some new power in a way that really worked out very well. I'm going to move us on just because we need to keep to time. Well, we don't need to keep to time, but I declare that we're going to keep to time. And we've talked about power, but we now need to talk about money. And I'm going to just share a reflection with you. This is a really tender story for me. but I think it was in 1943 or so, my grandmother gave my grandfather a $100 postal savings bond and said, invest it. And Grandpa went down to Merrill Lynch with his savings bond and opened an account. And he kept that account through his whole life. And when he was no longer able to manage that account, like read the statements and think through it all, we would do it every year at Thanksgiving. We'd open up a year's worth of statements and we'd call Merrill and we would say, this much cash has accumulated in the account. We want to do this with it. That portfolio was 100% equities. And he knew what each company on that list did and where they were. And you could notice a suspicious correlation between the cities where he had lived and the companies that operated there. Because when you move to a new town, you invest in the company that employs your neighbors. Because that's how we do it. If you looked at my investment portfolio right now, you're going to see a collection of mutual funds. And they're arranged to achieve a certain projected target outcome. I would be very hard-pressed to tell you what any of the companies within them do or where they're located, because they've been selected for a purpose, and that purpose is to produce a result. Grandpa selected his 100% equity portfolio to support his community and to achieve outcomes for his neighbors. I've selected mutual funds that are designed to produce a certain result in terms of the percentage outcome. That's different. That's different. That's so different that when Grandpa and I, before he passed, we used to call Merrill on the day after Thanksgiving to do whatever we needed to do, and they would say, sir, policy requires me to advise you that we can't recommend a 98-year-old man have a 100% equities portfolio. And he had to tell them that was okay. They had to hear his own creaky voice to say, this is okay, this is what we're doing, we understand the choices that we're making. It was a different perspective. I noticed a few years ago that our minds as philanthropists are going in the other direction. Grandpa used to give to his church. All of his charitable giving, virtually, was to his church. And his church would then decide how to use those dollars in the community. They would take your dollars, and your dollars, and your dollars, and my dollars, and your dollars, and pool them together, and then say, here's the place where those dollars can make the most concerted impact in the community. Here's what we as a church community are going to do for our wider community. We still give to the church. You all should still give to the church. Stewardship season is coming up. We'll be providing you an opportunity to give to the church. But I suspect that many of you also give to other organizations now. As you just think through that, that's a generational change. It used to be that the church was the community chest, and that community chest would dole out the money to various causes in the community. And it's not that way anymore. When we were preparing for the Capitol campaign, someone in this congregation really helped me understand this, and he didn't mean it in any critical way, but he said, Sandy, if my money is going to go to my fund, I want my name on the donor list. And that made a lot of sense to me. It's different than the classical understanding of church giving, but it's important for us to pay attention to. I've laid out, one key point. That's why I put key point in capital letters so that I don't miss it when I ignore my notes and just start talking. One key point. I would like to suggest that the next generation of givers are not constitutionally less generous. Now, it's true at Holy Communion, it's true in most of the nonprofits that I know, it's true in most of the churches that I know. Someone in the top 10 givers in an organization, or the top 10% of givers, tend to be older, and it tends to take a number of people in my age demographic to replace one of them when their giving stops. sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6 people in my generation to replace one from the younger generation. That to me does not say that the younger generations are constitutionally less generous. And I would offer as evidence for that the website GoFundMe.com, which brought in billions of dollars last year. Billions with a B of people supporting this cause or that cause or this cause or that cause. But notice the new power at work. It's a specific cause, it's a specific outcome, it's crowdsourced, nobody's telling you how to do it, nobody's going to exercise any sort of oversight over how the money is spent. I want it to go to this and that's going to happen. Which is exactly the reverse of how we're investing financially a lot of our money. So we've switched, right? It went from very specific investing in very general philanthropy to very general investing in very specific philanthropy. Generational shift. I'd like to suggest that there are generally 4 types of church giving and church givers. And they give for different reasons. And that's important for us to know. The first are the tithers. The tithers. These are people who heed or try to heed the biblical mandate of giving back the first 10% of their resources to the work of God in the church. This is how much I earned last year. This is 10% of it. That is going to be my pledge. Or, this is what I earned last year. This is 10% of it. I'm working towards that being my pledge. This type of giving is motivated by the giver's need to give, not the church's need to receive. This type of giving is given without restriction, because releasing control is part of the discipline. I'm not seeking to control the church with my money, I'm seeking to support the church with my money, and I give that control to the leadership of the church, which I believe seeks to follow God's guidance for how the church should be run. Tithers. Institutionalists. The church plays an important role in my life and in the community. The church, as an institution, needs to exist. The community needs the church to exist. We need the building, we need the clergy, we need electricity in the building and water. And I'm going to give to support the church's operating budget because I believe that this institution needs to be carried forward. That is a very different motivation for giving than tithing. I make no judgments here, I'm just saying it's different. Impactors. I give to the church because I can see the tangible results that my giving produces. These people are not going to be interested in the operating budget. These people are going to be willing to give to the capital campaign, willing to give to a youth mission trip, willing to give to a special appeal, but they're probably not going to be motivated by the general fund. Because that's just kind of there. That's the institution. It sort of rolls along. But I can see that I gave this money and this was the outcome. That I'm going to get on board with. That I'm going to get excited about. And then the last category I'm going to suggest we have are participants. Those who know that giving is part of being in the church, and so they're going to give something. They may see it as a fee-for-service arrangement. My children are in the youth group. My children are in the choir. I go to Sunday school. Whatever it is, that's worth something to me. I need to make sure that that gets provided for, so I'm going to give in that participation way. I make no judgments about these. I'm not putting any overlay on it. But what I'm going to suggest is that it's not helpful when church leaders critique this. It's not helpful when church leaders say things like, well, if everybody tithed, the church wouldn't have any financial problems at all. Not helpful. Because that's not the motivation for different folks. What I would suggest to you is that we have all 4 of these groups of people represented in every congregation in the Episcopal Church. But the blend is different. And I would suggest to you that as the younger, less institutionally minded, more secular culture generation starts to step to the fore, the blend is going to change. And we need to anticipate that change in blend. Imagine yourself as a tither. And I come to you and I say, we really need a 7% increase in the church's operating budget next year, because we have staff salary increases that we have to pay for, and we have maintenance costs are going up, and this. You are not going to be motivated by that. But if you're an institutionalist, you'll be very motivated by that. If you're an institutionalist and I say to you, you have a spiritual need to give more money to the church, that's not going to be persuasive either. That's not the place that you're operating in. What I would suggest to you is that most church giving campaigns and church giving approaches assume one of the categories or another, and that a strategy for success would be to acknowledge that we have all four kinds of givers, and we have people who give for different reasons, and a one-size-fits-all appeal is not going to be as successful as one that is tailored to explain the value as different people understand it. And let me say that's new. That's really new thinking for the Episcopal Church. Now, history always repeats itself, right? That we have in our minds the stewardship model of church giving, the philanthropy-based model. Everyone is asked to make a pledge. We give a pledge and this and that. This goes back to the early part of the 20th century, but it is not the only way that the church has ever funded itself. If you traipse through the churches of Northern Virginia, you will see little plaques on pews. You'll see many churches that have a George Washington plaque on their pew, everyone trying to lay claim to that particular pew owner. The reason for those plaques was that the church funded itself on pew rent. You rented your seat, and those who gave the most got the best seats. From that model towards this model, we had another model in between, and it was the sort of benefactor model. Jessica and I visited the American Cathedral in Paris this summer. It was paid for by J.P. Morgan. Some of the most influential families in American history said, we want the Episcopal Church. And they gave the money. And other people may have given as well, but when you got J.P. Morgan bankrolling your building, you don't have to have an aggressive stewardship campaign. What I suggest is we've gotten into this model of the pledge card and things like that because we know it and because it's familiar and because it's convenient, but it's a model. I don't know what the next model is, but I just want to keep holding up that it's a model. And there have been other models in our past, and transitioning from one to the next is hard. But that's probably the challenge that is ahead of us in the next half century. Can you imagine the transition from the pew rent model to the philanthropy model? General Washington, I know that you and your family have rented this pew for 100 years. But we're going to move to a model now where you are going to give the same amount or more to the church and receive nothing in return. I'm sure that'll be fine. That was going to be a tough transition. It's not easy to move from one model to the next model. And as we start to think about what would that be like, you can start to get a little uncomfortable. I get a little uncomfortable as the guy who has to manage the budget day in and day out. But I just hold up, it's a model. And models can change. And there are other models available. I just want to end with this one point that someday I'll publish a book and it'll have this title on it, and I'll make lots and lots of money, and I'll give all of it to the church, every single bit. Good stewardship is good pastoral care. Good stewardship is good pastoral care. Talking with people about what connects them to the church and what makes them feel good about the church and what makes them want to see the church succeed is pastoral care. And fundraising steps out of that. I'm looking around the room and I see a number of people who went out to make requests and asks during the capital campaign. And there was something special in that time about going into someone's home and seeing their personal things and their pictures and hearing their stories about why they love Holy Communion and what it was like to have their kids baptized there, that left us feeling warm and joy-filled. It was no chore to make those visits because we got to talk with people about why they love their church. That's pastoral care, and it's important. Thoughts and reactions. Is this the liberal priest has stepped out there again and we're rolling our eyes behind us? Or is this, no, he's on to something? Is it, yes, I can see why this might appeal to one group and maybe why it doesn't appeal to another? What's on your heart? What are your thoughts? Jeremy, please.
Well, as an economist, I need to push back on one thing you said. You said it takes 4 of younger folks to replace one of, an older member.
As on a giving dollars basis only.
Yeah.
So human beings are all equal.
Yeah. And it's because they just have more money. I think I looked at the stat and it's 10 to 12 times more than the average boomer generation family has 10 to 12 times more than the average millennial family. So the further that age group gets, the more expansive that gap is. So, but for us, I think we definitely fall in line with that average. One, we like to feel like we're part of something and give on a more individual basis, kind of reversing the stock and the philanthropy of your grandfather. So that's kind of our mindset. We like to see the impact and we like to feel involved with our giving.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you very much.
I'll also add that, and I might have missed this when we were in the restroom, but I think that you can also have individuals or families who are also a mix of those.
Oh, absolutely.
So we consider ourselves probably a 1 and a 3. And the way that we sit down and talk about our budget, it's very specific of, this is how it breaks down for giving, and it hits multiple of those because, we've got different histories with the institutional church as well as with nonprofit organizations.
That's so helpful, and thank you for being willing to share your personal experience. That's really, it's insightful and it's moving, and I'm really grateful for that. I mentioned that Maya was a scientist. Jeremy shared that he's an economist, and you know the difference between an optimist, a pessimist, and an economist? The optimist falls in a hole and says, I'm sure we're going to get out of this. I'm sure we're going to get out of this. And the pessimist says, no, we might as well just lie down and die. And the economist says, you both have it wrong. First, we assume that we have a ladder. Sorry. Marlene, please, then Ken.
I can't help but think, when we're thinking about the shift in power, that as we've observed, it's not just the church where this shift is going on. And oftentimes when I'm meeting with school boards, I remind them, they say, they run a school like a business. And I say, this school is much older than any business in this community. And the church is much older. And I think that, following Bishop Curry's reminder to all of us to remember what is important, that we love one another, and that as long as we keep in mind why we exist, we will continue as a faith, maybe not the same kind of institutional church, but certainly as a faith of Christians. And so I just, as I said, I think, yes, we are going to change, that's inevitable, but remembering to hold on to our foundation. And then I think, on the money side, because of this shift in power, I think more and more, as those of us who are older are no longer here, the 3s and 4s are the areas that we have to look to in terms of developing stewardship programs. And not that we want to do away with the ones into, the tithers, but just our shift in focus.
Yeah, it needs to be a both and.
Right.
And to your point, The church is, and the schools that you know are so much older than many of the businesses around us. And we can learn from our friends in the business community. We can learn from the best practices that the business community has developed, but then filter them through the lens of faith and the mission that we've established for ourselves. Does that fit here, or does that not fit here? What about that works in business? What about that might work here? And it's really a process of trying to get the best from all of these different fields so that we can develop the best way for us in our unique situation. Ken, please.
Thank you. You know, in our business, we have to be aware of, track retail patterns. And one of the trends in retail is with this generation, the millennial, the younger generation, they view things, what traditionally were economic decisions, dollars and cents to us, they view completely differently. They may spend more to buy a fair trade coffee because it guarantees a living wage, or they may make purchasing decisions around environmental concerns. And so what has historically in previous generations been straight dollars and cents, part of their whole kind of giving mindset is woven throughout their whole life.
Yeah.
And so it's a different model where historically it was firewall, a business life, running a household. My charitable over here,
Yeah.
and those things were kind of separate and distinct. That's not the case with younger generations.
That's so useful. And to hear that we're seeing this in the academic world, we're seeing it in the volunteer world, we're seeing it in the business world, we're seeing it in the church world, to me is evidence that we're watching a cultural shift happen before our eyes. And as an institution that can be a little dusty from time to time, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to that shift and knowing that we're responding to it. As I said last week, the truth of the gospel doesn't change, but people do, and the church must. So for the last 2 weeks, we've delved into the angstiness of all of this. Oh, change is coming, and oh gosh, culture, as young people, we ran out of letters to describe their generations, and it's all downhill from there, all of that. Next week is the class that I'm most looking forward to, so please come back. It's when I'm actually going to tell you what some friends who are running vibrant churches in secular places actually said when I asked them what should the strong churches in the South do now to prepare. They had really clear advice. I'll give you one hint. They all went straight to mission. Not one of them said, build the largest endowment you possibly can, which is what I was sort of thinking they were going to say. They all went straight to mission, and I'm just so excited about that. So please come back next week when we look at their actual words and think about them for ourselves. Church starts in about 10 minutes. We've got baptisms today in person. I love it. The whole community gathered. So don't miss, and church will start in about 10 minutes. Thank you all so much.